I'll raise your children, and you'll give me 5 more. Those were the words a grizzled mountain man spoke to a pregnant girl, standing barefoot in the snow with 2 little ones clinging to her skirts. In a town where no one else would help, he offered her a home, but also a bargain that left the whole street whispering. High in the Colorado mountains, his lonely cabin should have been their safe haven. But a letter from the railroad says it isn't their land for long. And when hired guns ride up with threats and a red X on the door, survival turns into a fight for everything they love. He's sworn to protect them. She's sworn never to depend on another man. But winter is closing in. The law is slow to listen, and an old treaty clause may be their only hope. Will this unlikely family stand their ground, or be driven from the only shelter they've got before spring thaw? Every story brings us a little closer together. Before we dive in, drop a comment with where you're tuning in from. It's a joy to see how far this family of listeners reaches. The January wind cut like a knife through Caleb McKenna's wool coat as he secured his mule's reins to the hitching post. The beast stamped its hooves against the packed snow, sending up small puffs of white in the gray afternoon light. Bear, as most folks called him due to his impressive height and broad shoulders, had spent 12 winters alone in his line shack up in the Colorado highlands. He knew better than to delay getting supplies when the weather turned mean. The crunch of his boots in the snow stopped short as he spotted the young woman. She stood near the general store's front steps, her thin shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. 2 small children, neither wearing proper boots, clung to her skirts. Even from this distance, Bear could see her trembling in the bitter cold. Her features spoke of mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and dark hair of her Apache blood softened by Irish curves around her eyes and mouth. What caught his attention most was the swell of her belly beneath the worn fabric of her dress. The door of the boarding house across the street slammed shut with such force that several chunks of snow fell from its eaves. A red-faced man in a fancy vest stood on the porch shouting, "Can't run a business on promises and prayers. No rent, no room. That's final." The young woman lifted her chin, though Bear could see her hand shaking as she gathered her children closer. "Please, Mr. Jenkins, just 3 more days. The mine office promised to release Thomas's last wages. Already told you, them wages went to cover his outstanding debts. Now clear off my property." Bear's jaw tightened as he watched the woman guide her little ones down the icy sidewalk. Their small feet left wet prints in the snow, and the sight of those tiny toes turning red in the cold stirred something deep in his chest, something he thought he buried years ago when he'd walked away from town life after his father's death. Inside the general store, the pot-bellied stove radiated welcome warmth, but Bear found his eyes drawn to the window. The clerk, Ted Wilson, cleared his throat impatiently while measuring out Bear's usual order of beans. "Something else you need today, Mr. McKenna?" Bear watched as the woman settled her children in the shelter of an alley, wrapping her shawl around their shoulders instead of her own. "That woman out there, what's her story?" A gruff voice answered from near the tobacco counter. "That's Mary Beth O'Rourke." The speaker was an older miner, his face creased like worn leather. "Her man Thomas was in my crew. Good worker, steady. And cave-in took him 3 weeks back, along with 2 others. The clerk sniffed disapprovingly. Half-breed gal like that, she ought to go back to her people. Bear's steel blue eyes fixed on Wilson, cold as the wind outside. The clerk swallowed hard and busied himself with the flour sack. "Her mother's people are White Mountain Apache," the old miner continued, ignoring Wilson's comment. "But they're 400 miles south. She was raised here after her folks married. Good woman, Mary Beth. Keeps to herself, works hard. Been taking and washing to feed them little ones, but..." He gestured to her swollen belly. "Won't be able to keep that up much longer." Bear nodded slowly, his mind working. He'd seen too many women and children left desperate after mining accidents. His own mother had struggled after his father's death, though at least he'd been old enough to help then. These little ones weren't more than 3 or 4 years old. "Add some sugar to my order," Bear said quietly, "and coffee. Good kind, not the cheap stuff." He paused, then added, "Wool socks too, children's size." The clerk's eyebrows rose, but he gathered the items without comment. Bear paid, then loaded his supplies into his saddlebags with deliberate care. The wind had picked up, driving tiny ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. He could see Mary Beth trying to shelter her children behind a stack of empty crates, her face pale with cold. Instead of mounting his mule for the long ride home, Bear found himself walking toward the alley. His heavy boots crunched in the snow, announcing his approach. Mary Beth looked up, wariness filling her dark eyes. She drew her children closer, and Bear noticed how she positioned herself between them and him, despite her obvious exhaustion. The protective gesture earned his respect. He stopped a careful distance away, making sure his empty hands were visible. Sometimes, out in the wild, you had to approach scared creatures gentle-like, give them space to settle. This felt no different. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice barely carrying above the wind's howl. "Looks like you and your little ones could use some shelter from this weather." Caleb McKenna cleared his throat. "Ma'am, let's get you in these. Little ones inside where it's warm. Storm's coming, and it ain't fit for anyone to be out here." Mary Beth O'Rourke studied him, her dark eyes weighing his words. One of her children, a boy with unruly black hair, pressed his face against her. "Skirts. I don't take charity, mister," she said, though her voice wavered from the cold. "Ain't charity to get out of killing weather," Mare answered. "Store's public place. Come warm yourself by the stove." After a long moment, Mary Beth nodded. She gathered her children, lifting the smaller one whose lips had started turning blue. Bear held the door, careful to keep his distance as she passed. The store's warmth hit them like a physical thing. The pot-bellied stove glowed cherry red in its corner, and Bear guided them toward it. The clerk, Wilson, opened his mouth as if to object, but a single look from Bear silenced him. Mary Beth sank onto a rough wooden chair, pulling both children onto her lap. Her shoulders trembled as feeling returned to her frozen limbs. Bear noticed how she kept one protective hand curved around her swollen belly. "Your man worked the Silver Strike mine?" Bear asked, keeping his voice gentle. She nodded. Thomas ... He was a good provider. We had savings, but the doctor bills took most before he ... Her voice caught. Then the mine office said his debts exceeded his final wages. No family to turn to? My father passed 2 summers ago. Mother's people are far south in Apache territory. She straightened her spine. I can work. Been taking in washing, but with the baby coming. The old miner who'd spoken earlier shook his head. Ain't right, leaving a widow and babies out in weather like this. Bear stood silent for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet store. "I'll raise your children, and you'll give me 5 more." The room went absolutely still. Mary Beth's head snapped up, color flooding her cheeks. "Are you mocking me, sir?" "No, ma'am." Bear's voice remained steady. "I've got a good cabin up in the Highlands. 2 rooms, solid roof. Plenty of food stored. Venison, fish, preserves. Got grazing land for livestock, good water source." He paused. "What I ain't got is family." Mary Beth's fingers clutched her shawl tighter. "You're proposing marriage? To a woman you've just met?" "Proposing survival," Bear corrected. "For you, them little ones, and the baby coming. I'm offering partnership, a roof, food, protection. You'd be mistress of your own home, raise your children proper. And 5 more? Her voice held a note of disbelief. Bear's expression didn't change. Good land needs sons to work it. Daughters too. Family's what makes a place worth having. The storekeeper cleared his throat. Mrs. O'Rourke, you're welcome to sleep in the back room tonight. Perhaps take time to consider. Storm's coming. Bear cut in. Heavy snow by nightfall. We need to leave now to make the cabin before dark. Mary Beth looked down at her children, who had begun to drowse in the stove's warmth. Her hand moved protectively over her belly again. When she raised her eyes to Bear's, there was steel in them. You're right about one thing, Mr. McKenna. This is about survival. She drew a deep breath. If you're offering honest partnership, not charity, not mockery, then I accept. Bear nodded once, then turned to the clerk. Need 3 wool blankets. Best you've got. Dried beef, hard candy for the little ones. He glanced at Mary Beth's bare ring finger. And whatever plain gold band you have in stock. While Wilson gathered the items, Bear spoke quietly to Mary Beth. Trail's rough, but my mule's steady. You and the children can ride. I'll walk alongside. My things, she started. Where are they? Where are they? Jenkins threw them in the alley. Just one trunk. Bear nodded. I'll fetch it. He paused. This ain't how most folks start a family, I know. But I aim to be a good provider, treat you and yours right. Something flickered in Mary Beth's eyes. Not quite trust, but perhaps the seed of it. My children come first, she said firmly. Always. As they should. Bear paid for the supplies, then helped Mary Beth wrap the children in the new blankets. The ring, a simple gold band, he tucked carefully into his coat pocket. There'd be time for that later, when they reached the cabin. Outside, the wind had shifted, bringing the scent of snow. Bear retrieved Mary Beth's trunk, securing it to the mule's back before helping her mount with the children. The little ones, bundled warm at last, blinked sleepily as Bear adjusted the blankets around them. The weak winter sun hung low on the horizon as Bear helped Mary Beth and the children mount the second mule. He'd arranged the blankets carefully, creating a nest of warmth for the toddlers against their mother's chest. The snow was just starting, delicate flakes drifting down like cotton wisps. Hold tight to the reins, Bear instructed, his voice barely carrying above the wind. Mule knows the trail, but ice makes her cautious. Mary Beth nodded, gathering her children closer. The boy, Timothy, had already dozed off against her, while little Sarah watched the falling snow with wide eyes. Bear shouldered his rifle and took the lead with his pack mule, setting a deliberate pace away from ridgetop. The town disappeared quickly behind them, swallowed by the growing dusk and thickening snow. Mary Beth found herself studying Bear's broad back as he walked ahead, noting how he constantly scanned the path, clearing branches when they hung too low. He moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew every rock and hollow of the trail dot as night crept in. The snow began to sting, driving sideways into their faces. Bear pulled his bandana up over his nose, and Mary Beth tucked her chin against her chest, shielding the children with her body. The mules plodded forward, their breath steaming in the frozen air. Creek ahead, Bear called back after what felt like hours. Need to water the stock. They stopped at a frozen creek, its surface gleaming dully in the fading light. Bear broke through the ice with his boot heel, creating a small pool where the mules could drink. Mary Beth's joints had grown stiff from riding, and she struggled to dismount with her swollen belly and sleeping children. Before she could call out, Bear was there, his strong hands gentle as he helped first Sarah, then Timothy down from the mule. He settled them on a fallen log, wrapped snugly in their blankets, before turning to assist Mary Beth. Much obliged, she murmured, stamping her feet to restore feeling. Bear nodded, already pulling dried beef and hard biscuits from his saddlebags. He handed portions to everyone. making sure the children had their share before taking any himself. Mary Beth noticed he'd given them the softer pieces of jerky, keeping the tougher ends for himself. The meal was brief and silent, interrupted only by the whisper of falling snow and the mule's quiet nickering. Bear moved with practiced efficiency, checking the animals' hooves for ice buildup, adjusting their loads, and refilling his canteen with creek water before helping them remount. He tucked the blankets more securely around the children, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he ensured no cold air could reach them. Only after everyone else was settled did he brush the gathering snow from his own coat. "Lean-to's not far," he said, taking up the lead rope again. "Hour, maybe less." The night deepened around them as they continued up the trail. The snow fell, harder now, thick flakes catching in Mary Beth's eyelashes. She could barely make out Bear's shape ahead, a darker shadow in the swirling white. The children slept against her, their warmth and weight both comfort and burden just when Mary Beth thought she couldn't stay upright any longer. Bear led them off the main trail. A crude lean-to emerged from the darkness, its slanted roof already wearing a blanket of snow. "Not much," Bear said, helping them down, "but it'll keep the worst of the weather off." The shelter was simple, 3 walls of rough-hewn logs and a sloping roof, but it blocked the wind. Bear quickly cleared away old leaves and scattered fresh pine boughs for bedding. He helped Mary Beth settle the children in the deepest corner, where 2 walls met, then added extra blankets from his pack. "Sleep now," he said, his voice low. "I'll keep watch." Mary Beth wanted to object. Surely he needed rest too, but exhaustion made her tongue too heavy for words. She curled around her children, one hand resting protectively on her belly, and watched through heavy eyes as Bear positioned himself near the open side of the lean-dash to Dot. He sat with his back against a post, rifle across his knees, snow gathering on his shoulders. The wind moaned through the trees, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Mary Beth lay awake, listening to her children's steady breathing and watching Bear's silhouette dot in the depths of night. As the storm howled around their shelter, Mary Beth's mind turned over her situation. She'd entrusted herself and her children to this stranger, this mountain man who spoke little and revealed less. He seemed capable, even kind in his gruff way, but she'd known other men who showed one face to the world and another in private. Yet, when she looked at Bear, still keeping his patient vigil while snow drifted over his coat, she saw something that gave her hope. Not in his words or promises, but in the quiet way he'd cared for her children, the careful attention to their comfort before his own. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, she hadn't traded one danger for another after all. Dawn crept over the mountains in pale strips of light. Bear was already moving, his boots crunching in the fresh snow as he gathered dry kindling from beneath the lean-to's overhang. Mary Beth watched through half-closed eyes as he built a small fire, carefully shielding the flame from the wind with his broad body until it caught. He hung his battered coffee pot over the flames, filling it with clean snow. The children stirred as the smell of coffee began to drift through their shelter. Sarah rubbed her eyes with tiny fists while Timothy snuggled closer to his mother's warmth. "Oats will be ready soon," Bear said quietly, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. He'd added a handful of dried berries, a touch that surprised Mary Beth. With its thoughtfulness, the morning meal was simple but filling. Bear made sure the children's bowls were filled first, watching with satisfaction as they spooned the hot food into their mouths. Mary Beth noticed how he'd positioned himself to block the worst of the morning wind from reaching them. As they broke camp, Bear worked with practiced efficiency. The lean-to was left as they'd found it, ready for the next traveler in need. Mary Beth helped where she could, though her swollen belly made movement awkward. Bear didn't comment, but she caught him watching, stepping in silently when she struggled with the heavier items. Their path led through a narrowing canyon, where walls of granite rose on either side. Massive icicles hung from the cliff faces, like nature's spears, catching what little sunlight filtered through the clouds. The children gaped at the ice formations, pointing and whispering to each other from their perch on the mule. "Pretty," Sarah said, reaching out as if to touch them. "Stay still," Bear cautioned, his voice gentle but firm. "Ice can fall." The storm returned by mid-afternoon, harder than before. The wind howled through the canyon like a hungry wolf, driving snow and ice before it. Bear led them to a natural shelter, a hollow ridge formed by fallen logs and stone, protected from the worst of the weather. "We'll wait it out here," he announced, helping Mary Beth and the children down from their mule. While Mary Beth settled the children in the deepest part of the shelter, Bear took up his axe. The rhythmic thunk of steel against wood soon filled the air as he split logs for their fire. Mary Beth watched him work between tending to the children, his powerful shoulders moving with practiced ease, each stroke precise and purposeful. The wind grew fiercer as darkness fell, but their shelter held firm. Bear built up the fire until it blazed cheerfully, pushing back the cold. He'd positioned stones around it to reflect heat into their refuge, and Mary Beth felt truly warm for the first time in days. "Here," Bear said after their evening meal, holding out his bedroll. "Take this spot by the fire. It's warmest." Mary Beth hesitated, but the offer was practical. She needed the warmth more than he did. Bear turned his back, giving her privacy as she settled herself and the children into the bedroll. She noticed he kept his distance, sitting with his back against a log, rifle ready across his knees. Morning brought clear skies and a landscape transformed by snow. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of sparkling white. Bear said little as they broke camp, but his expression lightened as they began the final climb to his homestead. They crested a rise in early afternoon, and Mary Beth caught her first glimpse of her new home. The cabin sat proudly on a small plateau, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the crystal-clear air. Sturdy log walls rose from a foundation of fitted stone, and a small barn stood nearby, its door securely latched against the weather. Bear led them to the cabin's front door, which he opened with a simple iron key. "Welcome home," he said quietly, stepping aside to let them enter. Mary Beth paused on the threshold, taking in the interior. The cabin was sparsely furnished, but solid, with a massive stone hearth dominating one wall. Heat radiated from the banked fire within, and the children immediately ran toward it, holding out their small hands to the flames. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs stood in the center of the room. Simple cupboards lined one wall, and she glimpsed a pantry beyond. 2 doors led to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was plain but well-made, speaking of careful craftsmanship rather than hasty construction. "Pantry's full," Bear said, following her gaze. "Got flour, beans, dried meat, preserves. But winter's long up here." He paused, looking at her directly. "We'll need to work together to see it through." Mary Beth nodded, understanding the unspoken message. This was no charity. It was a partnership for survival. But as she watched her children warming themselves by the fire, their faces glowing in the hearth's light, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Here was a roof that wouldn't be taken away, walls that would stand against the storm, and a man who, though strange to her, seemed to understand the meaning of responsibility. Morning sunlight streamed through the cabin's dusty windows as Mary Beth tied back her dark hair with a strip of cloth. The past 2 days had brought a rhythm to their strange new arrangement. She'd risen before dawn each morning, determined to prove her worth in this partnership of necessity. The cabin's main room, though sturdy, needed a woman's touch. Mary Beth attacked the dust first, using an old broom she'd found in the corner. Bear watched silently as she worked, saying nothing when she began organizing his scattered supplies into neat rows on the rough-hewn shelves. "Might as well make it proper," she murmured, mostly to herself, as she sorted through a pile of discarded grain sacks. The fabric was coarse but clean, and her nimble fingers soon had them transformed into simple curtains. She hung them carefully, the new cloth softening the harsh winter light dot in the pantry. She discovered Bear's impressive stock of dried venison and preserved vegetables. Her mother's Apache heritage had taught her well about flavoring even the simplest meals. That evening, she prepared a thick stew, adding wild herbs she'd found dried in Bear's stores. The aroma filled the cabin, drawing everyone to the table. Bear paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth, surprise flickering across his weathered features at the first taste. "This is good," he said simply, but Mary Beth caught the appreciation in his tone. The children, Timothy and Sarah, seemed to bloom in the cabin's warmth. Their initial shyness around Bear melted away as they watched him go about his daily tasks. They trailed behind him like eager puppies as he hauled water from the creek, their small boots leaving tiny tracks beside his large ones in the snow. Mind the ice? He'd warned them gently, showing them where to step. Mary Beth watched from the doorway as he taught them to test the ground before putting their full weight down. When he checked his snares, they followed at a careful distance, learning without words the patience required for survival in these mountains. On the morning of the third day, Mary Beth was kneading dough for bread when she heard the crunch of snowshoes on the crusty snow outside. Bear was already moving to the door, his rifle casually but readily in hand. She wiped flour from her fingers and drew the children closer, old fears rising despite the safety of these walls. The visitor was a tall man wrapped in a heavy coat, his breath frosting in the cold air. "The government business," he announced, pulling a sealed envelope from his coat. Bear took it without comment, breaking the seal as the man shifted from foot to foot, clearly anxious to be on his way. Mary Beth watched Bear's face as he read, noting how his jaw tightened and his shoulders stiffened. The messenger departed quickly, leaving only the sound of wind and the crackle of the hearth fire. "What is it?" she asked finally, when Bear continued to stare at the paper in his hand. He looked up, his expression dark. "Railroad companies claiming this land. Says we need to prove legal settlement by spring, or they'll force us out." His voice was controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. Mary Beth's heart dropped. She'd seen this before. Big companies pushing out small holders, using the law like a weapon. Her hands instinctively went to her swollen belly as fear gripped her. This cabin, this arrangement with Bear, it was all that stood between her children and the bitter cold of homelessness. "How can they do that?" she demanded, though she knew the answer. The law rarely favored people like them. Bear folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "They can try," he said grimly. "We'll fight it." He moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered land he'd worked for 12 years. "Don't know how yet, but we'll find a way." The children, sensing the tension, pressed against Mary Beth's skirts. She stroked their hair absently, her mind racing. Their fragile new beginning was already threatened, and she wondered if Bear realized that his casual use of "we" had sparked a fierce determination in her heart. This wasn't just his fight anymore. She watched as he pulled on his coat and stepped outside, probably to think things through in his own way. The morning sun caught the snow in brilliant sparkles, but its beauty seemed colder now, more threatening. Everything they had, his years of work, her chance at a new life, balanced on the edge of a paper decree. Mary Beth turned back to her bread dough, kneading it with renewed vigor. She might not know how to fight a railroad company, but she knew about survival. Together, they would find a way to keep this home, for all of them. Bear paced the cabin's length, his boots marking a path on the wooden floor. Through the morning light, he explained what the railroad's letter meant. his voice low and measured so as not to frighten the children playing by the hearth. "They want a straight shot through the valley," he said, gesturing toward the window where snow-capped peaks rose against the sky. "Railroad figures it's cheaper to cut through here than wind around the mountains to the south." Mary Beth sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands folded over her rounded belly. "But this is your land. You've worked it for years." 12 years. Bear's jaw tightened. "But Tom Randall, the local surveyor, he's been taking bribes. I reckon he sold them false rights to half the properties between here and Sterling Creek." "That snake," Mary Beth muttered, then glanced at the children to make sure they hadn't heard. "There must be something we can do." Bear leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "Law says we need proof of settlement. Records showing we're working. The land, making improvements." He paused, including her in that "we" without hesitation. Mary Beth's eyes brightened. "We could keep a household book," she suggested. "Write down everything. Repairs to the cabin, crops planted, animals tended." Her fingers traced patterns on the wooden table. "My ma taught me my letters good enough for that." Bear nodded slowly, appreciating her quick mind. "That might help. We'll need all we can get to fight them." As afternoon sun slanted through the new curtains, Bear took Timothy and Sarah outside. Mary Beth watched through the window as he knelt in the snow, showing them how to set simple snares with twine and small branches. His large hands moved slowly, demonstrating each step while the children watched with wide eyes. "Like this," she heard him say, helping Timothy bend a branch. "Gentle now. Rabbit's gotta feel safe coming close." Sarah copied her brother's movements, her small face scrunched in concentration. Bear praised their efforts with quiet words, and Mary Beth smiled to herself as she settled in a chair by the fire. She pulled out Bear's worn socks from her mending basket, noting the careful darning he'd attempted himself. The afternoon passed peacefully. Mary Beth's needle flashed in the firelight as she repaired torn seams and patched holes. Outside, Bear continued teaching the children, his patience never wearing thin despite their countless questions. When dusk approached, they all gathered around the table for a supper of beans and cornbread. Bear watched as Mary Beth efficiently served everyone, making sure the children's plates were filled first. "You've made this place run smoother in 3 days than I managed in 12 years, he admitted, breaking the comfortable silence. Mary Beth raised an eyebrow, a hint of mischief in her dark eyes. "Well, I suppose that's why you're counting on me for 5 more children." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Bear's ears turned red above his beard, but he didn't look away. "Meant what I said in town," he replied steadily. "Every word." To her surprise, Mary Beth felt a laugh bubble up, the first real one since her husband's death. It was a quiet sound, like wind through prairie grass, but it seemed to fill the cabin with warmth. After a moment, Bear's deep chuckle joined hers, and the children giggled too, though they didn't know why. As they cleaned up after supper, Mary Beth noticed the wind had stopped its constant howling. The night settled around them like a heavy blanket, unusually still for the mountains. Through the window, stars pricked the dark sky, sharp and clear in the winter air. Bear stood at the door for his usual evening check of the animals, but paused before stepping out. "We'll start that household book tomorrow," he said. "Record everything we do to improve the place." Mary Beth nodded, understanding that he was offering more than just a way to fight the railroad. He was offering her a real partnership in this home they were building together. The stillness deepened as Bear's boots crunched across the snow to the barn. Mary Beth tucked the children into their bed, then sat by the fire, her hands resting on her belly. The quiet felt like a breath held between moments, between what they had been and what they might become. The new curtains stirred slightly in, the draft from the chimney, and Mary Beth smiled, remembering Bear's surprised look when she'd hung them. Such a small thing, but it had marked the cabin as her home too. Now, with the railroad's threat hanging over them, she was determined to help him fight for it. She listened to the children's steady breathing and the distant sounds of Bear in the barn. Tomorrow they would begin documenting their life here. Every repair, every improvement, every step toward making this place undeniably theirs. But tonight, in this perfect stillness, she simply let herself feel grateful for warm walls and the beginning of trust between two wounded souls. The January cold settled deep into the valley, wrapping Bear's cabin in thick blankets of snow. Each morning, frost patterns decorated the windows like delicate lace, catching the pale winter light. The sound of chopping echoed through the crisp air as Bear showed Mary Beth how to split logs behind the cabin. "Hold the axe like this," Bear demonstrated, his large hands positioning the handle. "Keep your grip firm but not tight." He stepped back, watching as Mary Beth lifted the axe. "My wrist keeps wanting to turn," she admitted, adjusting her stance. In the packed snow, Bear moved closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "That's what'll hurt you. Keep your wrist straight. Let the weight of the axe head do the work." He guided her hands through the motion slowly. "Bear, feel that?" Mary Beth nodded, concentrating. The axe came down clean, splitting the log with a satisfying crack. A smile spread across her face as the pieces fell apart. "Well done," Bear said quietly, already setting up another log later that afternoon. Mary Beth sat at the table by the window, showing Bear how to repair his worn boots. Her fingers worked skillfully with the deer sinew she'd prepared. "See how the sinew goes through both sides?" She demonstrated the careful stitching. "It's stronger than regular thread. My mother taught me. She learned it from her people." Bear watched intently, his usual silence filled with genuine interest. "Reckon that'll hold better than my attempts," he admitted, examining the neat stitches. The children had been restless, confined by the winter weather. Bear surprised them all by suggesting a trip to the frozen pond he knew nearby. They bundled up in layers of wool and fur, Mary Beth wrapping extra scarves around the children's faces until only their bright eyes showed. Bear had fashioned rough skates from wooden boards, attaching them to the children's boots with leather straps. Timothy and Sarah squealed with delight as they slid across the ice, holding on to their mother's hands. Even Bear's stern face softened watching them play. The winter sun hung low in the sky when they started home. Bear led the way, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Suddenly, he pulled his mule to a stop, studying the snow ahead. "Wolf tracks," he said grimly, pointing to the clear prints crossing their path. "Fresh ones. Made since we passed through earlier." Mary Beth instinctively gathered the children closer on their shared mount. "Are they close?" "Can't tell for certain." Bear's hand rested on his rifle. "We'll take the longer route home. Stay in the open where we can see better." They rode in tense silence, Bear watching the tree line while Mary Beth kept the children quiet with whispered stories. The sun had set by the time they reached the cabin's warm safety. That evening, Mary Beth stirred the pot of beans simmering over the fire while cornbread baked in the Dutch oven. The familiar scents filled the cabin, making it feel more like home with each passing day. The children played quietly with wooden figures Bear had carved for them. As they ate, Bear spoke unexpectedly of his mother. "She used to pray every morning and night," he said, breaking a piece of cornbread. "No matter what came, drought, storms, fever, she'd kneel by her bed and talk to God like he was right there listening." Mary Beth looked up, surprised by this sharing of memory. "Did it help her?" "Seemed to give her peace," Bear replied thoughtfully. "Even when Pay died in that mine collapse, she kept praying. Said it helped her see beyond the dark times." Mary Beth's hands stilled on her plate. "I haven't prayed since Thomas died," she confessed softly. "Felt like God wasn't listening anymore." Bear was quiet for a long moment, watching the firelight play across the cabin walls. "Might be time you did," he said finally, his voice gentle after the children were asleep and Bear had gone out for his evening check of the animals. Mary Beth sat alone by the fire. The flames danced before her eyes as she thought about Bear's words, about his mother's faith that endured through all hardship, about this strange new life they were building, a marriage of necessity slowly growing into something more. She touched her rounded belly, feeling the baby move, the cabin around her was becoming a real home, with curtains at the windows and children's laughter in the corners. Bear's quiet strength and surprising gentleness had begun to fill the empty spaces left by grief. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney into the winter night. Mary Beth found herself whispering words she hadn't spoken in months. Not quite a prayer yet, but a beginning, a reaching out toward hope again. Outside, snow began to fall softly, adding another layer to the white blanket covering their mountain home. The late February thaw came suddenly, turning the pristine snow into patches of brown slush. Water dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, and the sound of running streams filled the valley as winter's grip began to loosen. Bear was splitting wood near the barn when he heard hoofbeats approaching. 3 riders appeared through the melting snow, their horses picking their way carefully along the muddy trail. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man in a fine wool coat, pulled up first. "McKenna?" the man called out, consulting a folded paper. "Caleb McKenna?" Bear set his axe against the chopping block, straightening slowly. "That's right." The man dismounted, revealing an expensive pair of boots that had clearly never seen real ranch work. "Name's Harrison, foreman for the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He gestured to his companions, who remained mounted. "We've come to discuss the matter of this land claim." Mary Beth appeared in the cabin doorway, drawn by the voices. The baby, not yet 2 weeks old, was cradled against her hip. She watched silently as Harrison pulled more papers from his coat. "Company's prepared to be generous," Harrison said, moving closer to Bear. $50 cash to vacate the property within the month. He held out the papers. "These show clear title through the territorial office." Bear didn't take the offered documents. "This land's not for sale," he said quietly. "My father's buried on that ridge." He pointed toward the western slope. "Been here 12 years now." Harrison's friendly expression hardened. "Listen here, McKenna. This isn't a negotiation. Railroad's coming through, whether you like it or not. Take the money while it's offered." Mary Beth stepped down from the porch, her boots crunching in the remaining snow. The baby stirred against her shoulder as she came to stand beside Bear. "You're wasting your time," she said clearly, meeting Harrison's surprised look. "We're not leaving." Harrison studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined stance and the confident way she held herself despite the infant in her arms. His eyes narrowed. "Think carefully, ma'am," he said. "Winter's not done yet. Would be shame if anything happened to your little family up here, all alone." Bear took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. But Mary Beth touched his arm lightly, her voice steady. "We're not alone, and we're not afraid." Harrison's jaw tightened. He crumpled the papers back into his pocket. "We'll be back," he said shortly. "Smart folks know when to get out of progresses." "Way." He swung back onto his horse, gesturing to his men. They wheeled their mounts around, heading back down the trail. Bear and Mary Beth watched until the riders disappeared into the trees. Only then did Bear let out a long breath. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for standing with me." Mary Beth adjusted the baby's blanket. "This is our home now. All of us." She looked up at him. "I won't let them take it." Bear nodded, his expression determined. "Let's get ready then." They'll try again. They spent the rest of the day working to strengthen their defenses. Bear replaced the worn hinges on the cabin door with sturdy new ones he'd been saving. Mary Beth helped him check every board on the barn, identifying weak spots that needed reinforcement as the sun began to set. Bear hammered the last board into place on the barn door. Mary Beth brought him a cup of coffee, steam rising in the cool evening air. "Feels like preparing for siege," she said, watching him test the door's strength. "Might come to that." Bear took a sip of coffee. "Railroad companies don't give up easy. Seen them burn out settlers before. Mary Beth's hand went to the medicine pouch she wore beneath her shawl, a gift from her mother, filled with sacred herbs and prayers. "Them will be ready," she said firmly. "My mother's people knew how to defend their land. So did my father's." Bear looked at her thoughtfully. In the weeks since their hasty marriage, he'd come to respect her quiet strength more each day. Now, watching her scan the valley with alert eyes while holding their newest child, he felt something deeper stirring, something beyond their original agreement of convenience. They worked until dusk, moving supplies into the root cellar and making sure the water barrel was full. The older children helped too, carrying kindling and stacking it carefully by the hearth. Even they seemed to sense the importance of their preparations as night fell. Bear made one last circuit of the property, checking his improvements in the dying light. The cabin stood solid against the darkening sky, lamplight glowing warmly through Mary Beth's curtains. He could hear her voice inside, singing softly to the children, a mix of Irish lullaby and Apache melody that somehow fit perfectly in these mountains. This was what he was defending, he realized. Not just the land, but the home they were building on it. The family they were becoming. March brought warmer winds and rapid snowmelt to the high country. The creek that ran past Bear's cabin swelled with icy runoff, its banks overflowing into the lower meadow. The sound of rushing water filled the valley day and night, making the worn trail to town treacherous with mud and fallen branches. Mary Beth woke before dawn one morning, her hands pressed against her swollen belly. The baby wasn't due for another 2 weeks, but she recognized the familiar tightening of her muscles. She touched Bear's shoulder gently. "It's time," she whispered. Bear sat up immediately, fully alert. He'd been sleeping lightly these past weeks, worried about both the railroad men's threats and Mary Beth's condition. The wind rattled the cabin's windows as he quickly built up the fire. "Children," he called softly to the corner where the little ones slept. "Need your help." The toddlers stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Bear handed them the water buckets, sized just for their small hands. "Fill these at the creek. Careful now. Don't get too close to the bank." As they hurried out, Bear put the large iron kettle on to boil. Mary Beth paced slowly, one hand braced against the rough-hewn wall. Her face was calm, but Bear could see the tension in her shoulders. "You've done this before," he said, trying to sound reassuring. Mary Beth managed a small smile. "3 times. But never," she paused, breathing through a contraction. "Never with just you helping." Bear nodded gravely. He'd assisted with calving and helped birth foals, but this was different. This was Mary Beth. This was their child. The morning wore on, and the wind grew stronger. It howled through the pine trees, driving sheets of icy rain against the cabin. Bear kept the fire stoked high, making sure the room stayed warm. He heated water, laid out clean linens, and helped Mary Beth walk when she needed to move. Her labor pains intensified as the sun climbed higher. Bear sent the children to the barn with bread and cheese, knowing they shouldn't see their mother suffering. Mary Beth gripped his hand through each contraction, her knuckles white with effort. "Tell me about your mother," she gasped between pains. "What was she like?" Bear wrung out a cool cloth for her forehead. "Strong, like you. Never complained, even when times were hard." He dabbed at her face gently. She used to sing hymns while she worked, said it made the labor lighter. Mary Beth tried to smile, but another contraction took her breath away. The storm reached its peak outside, rain drumming on the roof like 1,000 hooves. "It's coming," she whispered urgently. "Bear." He positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his heart pounding but his hands steady. "I'm here. You can do this." Mary Beth bore down with all her strength. Bear watched in wonder as new life emerged into his waiting hands. The baby came with a rush, slick and perfect, letting out a lusty cry that seemed to quiet the storm itself. "A boy," Bear said softly, wrapping the infant in a clean blanket. Strong and healthy. Mary Beth reached for her son, tears mixing with sweat on her cheeks. "Daniel," she said clearly, "after my father." Bear helped settle the baby against her chest, marveling at how something so small could feel so significant. He watched them together, this woman who had come to his cabin out of desperate necessity, now holding their child. Something shifted in his heart, like ice breaking up in spring. He touched the baby's tiny hand with one rough finger. Daniel gripped it immediately, his whole fist not even covering Bear's knuckle. In that moment, Bear made a silent vow to protect them all, to keep this family safe, to build something lasting on this contested land. The storm began to ease as evening approached. Bear brought the older children in to meet their new brother. They gathered around the bed, touching Daniel's dark hair and counting his fingers in whispered awe. Night settled over the cabin, bringing a gentle peace. The fire crackled low in the hearth, sending up the sweet scent of pine smoke. Daniel's small cries punctuated the quiet as Mary Beth nursed him, her voice humming soft Apache lullabies. Bear sat in his chair by the fire, watching over them all. The wind had died down to a whisper, and stars were visible through breaks in the clouds. His cabin had never felt more like a home than it did in this moment. Filled with the sounds of his family settling into sleep, he thought about the railroad, men and their threats, about the battles that surely lay ahead. But looking at Mary Beth and Daniel, at the children curled up together in their corner, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would find a way to keep them all safe. This was what he had been waiting for, all those lonely years in the high country. This was worth fighting for. 2 days after Daniel's birth, spring sunshine warmed the valley. Bear stood in the yard, rhythmically splitting logs for the cooking fire. His axe rose and fell in steady strokes, the sharp crack of wood echoing across the meadow. The morning dew had burned off, leaving the air crisp and clear. Inside the cabin, Mary Beth changed Daniel's wrappings while the older children played quietly with wooden figures Bear had carved. The peaceful routine of their morning shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. 4 riders appeared around the bend, their horses' flanks lathered from hard riding. Bear recognized the railroad foreman's gray gelding leading the group. He set his axe against the chopping block and straightened, watching them approach. The men didn't bother dismounting properly. They swung down from their saddles, boots hitting the mud with heavy thuds. Their leader, a man with a week's worth of beard and cold eyes, stalked toward the cabin. "Time's up, McKenna," he shouted. "This is your last warning." Before Bear could move, the foreman's boots slammed into the cabin door. The rough-hewn wood splintered around the latch. Another kick sent it crashing inward. Mary Beth stood in the middle of the cabin, Daniel clutched to her chest. The other children huddled behind, her skirts, eyes wide with fear. She lifted her chin as the men crowded the doorway. "Get out," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You have no right here." The foreman laughed, an ugly sound. "We got every right, woman. This land belongs to the railroad now." He pulled a stick of red chalk from his vest pocket and walked to the wall beside the fireplace. With deliberate strokes, he drew a large X across the logs. "That's the demolition mark," he sneered. "When we come back, This cabin comes down, whether you're in it or not. Mary Beth didn't move from her protective stance. My children were born here, she said firmly. This is our home. Ain't gonna be nobody's home once we're done. Another man stepped forward, knocking Mary Beth's carefully arranged cooking pots off their shelf. They clattered across the floor, making the children jump. The sound of running footsteps announced Bear's arrival. He filled the doorway, chest heaving, eyes dark with rage as he took in the scene. His broken door, the red X on his wall, Mary Beth. Standing fierce and protective before their children, the foreman turned with a mocking grin. Just marking what's ours, McKenna. Next time we bring more than chalk. Bear's hand twitched toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace. The muscles in his jaw clenched as he watched the men swagger back to their horses, their laughter drifting. On the spring air, he took one step toward his weapon, but Mary Beth's hand caught his arm. Her fingers dug into his sleeve with surprising strength. No, she said quietly. Violence will only bring more violence. They'd love an excuse to gun you down. Bear's breath came hard and fast. Can't let them threaten my family. Listen to me. Mary Beth shifted Daniel to one arm, keeping her other hand firmly on Bear's sleeve. My uncle, Red Eagle, he used to tell me about the treaties. There's a clause about land rights being tied to family settlements. If a child is born on the land, it strengthens the claim. It's the claim. Bear turned to look at her, the rage in his eyes slowly giving way to attention. Daniel was born here, she continued. We can document it, get witnesses from town. The railroad can't just take land where families are legally settled, especially not with children born on it. Bear's breathing steadied as he considered her words. Your uncle, he knows about these treaties. Mary Beth nodded. He studied them carefully. Had to, dealing with government agents all these years. He knows which words matter, which rights can't be ignored. Hope flickered across Bear's weathered face. He looked at the red X defacing his wall, then at Daniel sleeping peacefully in Mary Beth's arms. The child's tiny fist was curled against her shawl, his dark hair still damp from his morning washing. Legal fight instead of a shooting fight, Bear said slowly. Might be our best chance. Mary Beth squeezed his arm gently before letting go. It's our only chance, she corrected. And we have something they don't expect, knowledge of the law they can't ignore. Bear nodded, decision made. He moved to the broken door, lifting it back into place and examining the splintered wood. The children crept out from behind Mary Beth, helping to gather the scattered pots while she settled Daniel in his cradle. Outside, dust still hung in the air from the rider's departure. Bear could follow their tracks easily enough, could catch them at the narrow pass before town. But Mary Beth was right. Violence would only give them the excuse they wanted. Instead, he began mentally listing what they'd need. Birth records, witness statements, treaty documents. A different kind of fight lay ahead, but one they might actually win. The morning after the railroad men's visit dawned cold and quiet. Bear stood in the doorway, studying the broken wooden planks. The splintered edges needed more than simple nails to hold firm. He'd have to reinforce the frame before they could leave. We'll need to reach Silver Creek by week's end, Mary Beth said from behind him. Daniel cradled against her shoulder. That's where the county records office is. Bear nodded, already mentally calculating the journey. 4 days' travel, if the weather holds. He glanced at the sleeping toddlers. Won't be easy with little ones. Nothing about this has been easy, Mary Beth replied, her voice soft but determined. She shifted Daniel to her other shoulder, patting his back. But we've got no choice. The railroad won't wait for spring. Bear spent the morning repairing the door, carefully fitting new crossbeams and securing the hinges. The sound of his hammer echoed across the snow-patched yard. Inside, Mary Beth moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for their journey while tending to Daniel Dodd. She laid out clean cloth for swaddling, cutting strips from her old shawl. The fabric was warm but soft, perfect for keeping the newborn warm. Her fingers worked steadily, folding and stacking the bands while she hummed an old Apache lullaby. The older children helped in their way, bringing her things when asked. Sarah, the eldest at 4 years, carefully arranged her little brother Tommy's spare shoes near the door. Their small boots were well worn, but sturdy enough for winter travel. By afternoon, Bear had finished with the door. He turned his attention to loading the wooden sled, laying down a base of hay before adding their supplies. Dried meat, hard bread, and beans went in first, followed by extra blankets and furs. He packed his rifle and ammunition carefully, hoping they wouldn't be needed. "We'll leave at first light," he told Mary Beth as evening approached. Best to make distance while the snow's still firm. That night, neither of them slept much. Mary Beth nursed Daniel twice, watching the moonlight trace patterns on the cabin floor. Bear checked and rechecked their supplies, adding extra kindling and flint to the packs. Dawn arrived under heavy clouds, the sky a solid sheet of gray. Bear hitched the stronger mule to the sled, while Mary Beth bundled the children in layers of wool and fur. Daniel she kept close to her chest, wrapped snugly in his new swaddling. "The weather's turning," Bear observed, studying the sky. "We'll need to make good time before it breaks." They set out just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Bear led the way, breaking trail through patches of crusty snow. The sled runners creaked behind the mule, loaded with their supplies and the 2 older children. Mary Beth rode the second mule, Daniel secure in a sling across her chest. The morning passed slowly. Bear walked beside the sled, often helping the mule through deeper drifts. His boots left deep prints in the snow, marking their slow progress down the valley. When they stopped to rest the animals, he noticed Mary Beth watching the sky with concern. "Clouds are getting lower," she said, adjusting Daniel's wrappings. "Storm's coming." Bear nodded. "We'll make for Cedar Grove before dark. Good shelter." There, they pushed on through the afternoon. The wind picked up, carrying the sharp scent of snow. Bear's legs grew heavy from breaking trail, but he kept moving. Every step took them closer to saving their home. Sarah and Tommy dozed in the sled, wrapped in furs against the cold. Mary Beth hummed softly to Daniel, who remained remarkably quiet despite the journey's discomfort. Bear found himself drawing strength from their presence, from the trust they placed in him. As dusk approached, they reached the grove Bear had mentioned. Tall cedars rose around them, their branches offering shelter from the wind. Bear chose a spot where 2 fallen logs created a natural windbreak. While Mary Beth fed Daniel by the newly lit fire, Bear set up their camp. He arranged the sled to block the wind and laid out their bedrolls on fresh cedar boughs. The older children helped gather small sticks for the fire, their cheeks red from the cold but their spirits high at the adventure. The flames cast dancing shadows on the snow as night settled in. Bear heated beans and coffee, while Mary Beth got the children ready for sleep. She tucked them into the pile of furs, making sure their feet stayed warm. "You should rest, too," Bear told her, noting the tiredness in her eyes. "Long day tomorrow." Mary Beth nodded, settling Daniel against her chest. The baby's small sounds mixed with the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind in the cedars. Bear added more wood to the flames, watching as his family drifted off to sleep. He sat with his back against a log, rifle across his knees. Above the cedars, the clouds hung low and heavy. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, his family slept safe and warm. Bear settled in for his watch, listening to the night sounds of the winter forest and the soft breathing of those in his care. The morning brought heavier snow, falling in thick, wet flakes that clung to their clothes and made the going slower. Bear pressed forward, breaking trail through drifts that sometimes reached his knees. The loaded sled creaked behind him, runners cutting deep tracks in the fresh powder. "How much further?" Sarah asked from her nest of blankets in the sled. Her brother Tommy huddled close beside her. "Few more hours," Bear answered, his breath clouding in the cold air. The mule strained against the harness, and he stopped to adjust the straps, brushing away built-up snow. Mary Beth rode behind them on the second mule, Daniel wrapped warm against her chest. She had been quiet most of the morning, conserving energy, but now she started humming. The melody of Amazing Grace drifted through the falling snow, steady and sure. The children perked up at the familiar tune, and even Bear felt his spirits. Lift up by midday, they reached the river. Its surface was a sheet of gray ice, marked here and there with snowdrifts. Bear tested the ice carefully, choosing the safest crossing point where the current ran slowest. "Stay here," he told his family, then led the first mule out onto the ice. Each step was measured, careful. The ice held firm. He returned for the second mule, helping Mary Beth guide it across while she held Daniel close. Near the center of the river, Bear knelt and used his axe to chip through the ice. The water below was black and swift, but the mules drank eagerly. When he cleared enough space, Mary Beth continued her hymn, the sound carrying across the frozen landscape. It seemed to calm the animals as much as the children. The afternoon sun was already low when they spotted smoke rising above the trees. The roadhouse appeared through the snow, a sturdy two-story building with warm light showing through its windows. Bear had 2 rabbits from that morning's trap check still fresh in his pack. The roadhouse keeper was a broad-shouldered woman named Martha, her gray hair tied back in a severe bun. She eyed the family, noting Mary Beth's obvious exhaustion and the small bundle at her chest. 2 rabbits, you say?" Martha examined the pair Bear offered. "Clean kills, dressed proper. Reckon that's worth a night's board, especially with little. One's in need of warming." Inside, the main room was filled with the smell of beef stew and wood smoke. The children gravitated toward the massive stone fireplace, while Mary Beth found a chair close to its warmth. Daniel stirred and fussed until she loosened his wrappings. Other travelers gathered around as Bear helped Martha stable the mules. Cattle buyer from Denver, 2 miners heading to new claims, and a newspaper man from Colorado Springs all shared the common room. "What brings you folks out in weather like this?" the newspaper man asked, warming his hands by the fire. Bear settled into a chair near Mary Beth before answering. "Heading to the county seat. Railroad's trying to take our land. Got papers to file proving it's ours by right." The room grew quiet, except for the crackling fire. The cattle buyer leaned forward. "Railroad, you say? Western Pacific's been pushing hard through these parts, causing trouble for more than a few honest folks. They marked our cabin for demolition," Mary Beth added softly, "but we've got prior claim. Our son was born there just days ago." The newspaper man pulled out a small notebook. "Mind telling me more about that? Public ought to know how the railroad's treating frontier families." As Bear explained their situation, Martha brought bowls of hot stew. The rich broth and tender meat seemed to restore everyone's energy. The children fell asleep soon after, curled up on blankets near the fire. The evening passed with more questions, more stories shared. Other travelers offered suggestions about filing claims, names of sympathetic judges, similar cases they'd heard about. The newspaper man took careful notes down when morning came. The snow had settled into a light dusting. The sky showed patches of pale blue between the clouds. Bear checked the sled while Mary Beth prepared Daniel for the final leg of their journey. "Word will spread about what you're doing," Martha told them as they prepared to leave. "Folks don't take kindly to railroad bullies, not in these parts." The courthouse rose before them, a 3-story brick building with white columns catching the midday sun. Bear helped Mary Beth down from her mule, while the children stared up at the imposing structure with wide eyes. Inside, their boots echoed on the polished wooden floors. The main courtroom smelled of tobacco and old wood, with sunlight streaming through tall windows. Several men in dark suits turned to watch them enter, including the railroad foreman who stood at the back, his face twisted in a scowl. "Your Honor," Bear said, approaching the judge's bench. His voice was steady despite the tension in his shoulders. He pulled out the carefully preserved papers from his coat. The marriage declaration first, signed by Reverend Matthews just weeks after they'd reached his cabin. The judge, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, examined each document carefully. "And you have witnesses to verify your settlement?" "Yes, sir," Bear nodded. "Got written testimony from Mr. Hammond, the storekeeper in Ridgetop. He saw us leave town together. Knows we've been living as family since January." Mary Beth stepped forward, Daniel sleeping against her chest. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" The judge nodded, and she drew herself up straight. Despite the railroad foreman's burning glare from the gallery, her voice rang clear through the courtroom. "Our son Daniel was born in that cabin 2 weeks past. We've worked that land together, made it a home for our children. The railroad men came with threats and destruction, but that land is ours by right of settlement and family." The judge studied the birth record, then looked over his glasses at the railroad's lawyer. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, he straightened in his chair. "The documentation is in order. Under territorial law, this represents a valid homestead claim with clear evidence of settlement and family residence." He tapped his gavel once. "The railroad must alter their proposed route. This land belongs to the McKenna family." Bear let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Outside on the courthouse steps, the foreman stormed past them, spitting into the melting snow before mounting his horse and riding away. Mary Beth gripped Bear's arm, her shoulders finally relaxing. The threat that had haunted them through the long winter was over. Their home was secure at last. The journey home felt lighter, with spring's promise in the air. As they crested the final ridge, their cabin came into view, nestled among the towering pines like a welcome friend. The creek rushed nearby, swollen with snowmelt, its voice stronger than when they'd left. Bear wasted no time attacking the damaged wall where the railroad men had left their mark. The steady rhythm of his hammer filled the afternoon as he replaced the marked boards with fresh-cut pine planks. Mary Beth watched him work while she prepared their evening meal, Daniel sleeping peacefully in his cradle. When supper was ready, they gathered around the table, a family now bound not just by necessity, but by choice and victory. The older children eagerly spooned up their stew, their faces glowing in the warm lamplight. Mary Beth settled into her rocking chair, Daniel nursing contentedly. Her eyes met Bear's across the room, a smile playing at her lips. "You still want those 5 more?" she asked, her voice teasing but tender. Bear's weathered face broke into a rare, full grin. "If they're all as strong as you, I'll take as many as God gives us." Outside, snow began falling softly against the windows. But inside their home, truly and legally theirs at last, the warmth went deeper than any fire could reach. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.